second stack. What if you're watching now? What you didn't see, which was behind the Patreon wall, or which is over on the Patreon, is was all the cleanup and prep work that goes in, that I go through to prep a billet. So now it's welded and stacked. It's here. Let me back it up. So here, billet is tall, too tall for my forge. So I chose to not put a handle on it, so that I can just manage it without a handle, which I do a lot actually with other billets. This one's a little bigger than I normally would do, about 4 times basically as big as I normally would do. But I think it's going to be manageable. We just got to get in there and do it. So here, let's turn this around. Actually, I can just go straight in. It's open. Something I might do actually real quick is I might take a second to adjust these palms. So here, let me bring this down. Yeah, there you go. So adjust these palms real quick so that they fit. Another nice soft flame coming out of the front. I see a little better with the black background. Doesn't need to be huge, just a little bit. It's probably cruising at about 2100, 2200 degrees in there. Yeah, good and hot. So we're just gonna let it do its thing. While it's doing that, we'll have a little chat about what the heck is going on right now with the steel. Okay. Actually, let me go grab my pen real quick. Alright, so actually, I'm going to turn this around. Look straight on at it. Alright, so this is where we are. We have an S-bar right here, and I cut it into 8 pieces and stacked it up. Now, this stack is quite tall, like I said, so I didn't put a handle on it. So what I need to do is set these, but one thing to keep in mind, or recognize here, is that instead of mirroring them across their new weld boundaries, I maintain this orientation on every piece throughout the stack. So next, and I didn't take the time to draw the pattern on all these different pieces just look right, and it kind of distracts from being able to actually see what's going on in the steel. Okay, so we got our stack. We reduce it down in height to get it solidly welded, and then we're going to turn it on a partial bias while it's still in a rectangular form, and so that we can forge it out of square intentionally. Sometimes this happens accidentally. We're going to do it intentionally. We'll see what happens. The forge press, often, if you're only working from one direction, the billet, like the handle on the same side, working only from one direction, this will happen naturally. But we're going to do it intentionally, whether it's happening or not. If not, encourage what's already occurring. So we're going to forge it out of square intentionally, and this process is called my off square book mesh. This is just like the second stage of it. So forge it off square, we'll get kind of this parallelogram kind of look. All of the pieces right here, you can see they're running straight side to side. But once we forge it out of the square, we're creating this angular activity. So, but if we go straight to this step where we're forging those points back in, we're just going to undo what we just did. So to lock in that angular activity, after we forge it out of square and have those tile or those mosaic elements running at an angle, we're going to turn it on the flats or the wide faces, and we're going to forge against those. And that's going to help us to lock in that angular activity, so that when we get to this part here and we're forging this point back in, so that we have a regular rectangle to work with, we get back to our regular rectangular shape, but we still have that angular activity. So that's what we got going on. Here, I'm actually going to just float here for a second in case somebody needs a screenshot. All right, so that is what is happening with that. This billet should be coming up to temp. How's everybody doing today? Who's in here? Ah, Rich is back in the house. What's up, buddy? What is up? I'm trying to figure out this trying to figure out the best way to put this thing, the camera, in the mount so that it's seeing what it needs to see, but I also have the ability to adjust where it's at. What's going on? I want to show you guys something interesting. So I use a special Sharpie marker. It's still Sharpie brand, but it's the industrial super permanent ink. Okay? You can find them on Amazon. Last time I bought a box was like 3 years ago, and it was like 24 bucks. So when I was cutting all these tile pieces up, I labeled them all, right? Check this out. Steel, it's starting to glow incandescent. It's probably hitting 1100 degrees. You can still see part of the number 8. Oh, it just went away. Ha! I was seeing it while I was talking. I could still see the 8, and it's like that steel is up to probably like actually more like 1200 degrees. Anyways, I always think it's really interesting that you can see that ink up to such a high temperature. How's the morning going for folks? Getting started a little bit later than I initially wanted to. The steel's actually coming up to temp nicely. I'm gonna give it a quick rotation. The billet does not have a handle on it. The billet ended up taller than my forge. Normally what I would do is, when I'm forging out a bar, whether it's a mosaic bar or a random pattern bar or whatever, if I know how many pieces I want in my next stack, I knew I wanted 8, right? Then I would say, okay, I know my clearance in my forge is like 4.5, maybe 5 inches. I like to stay at the 4.5 or lower. So let's just say I wanted the stack to be 4 inches. Then you take that height divided by how many amber pieces you want in that next restack, and that tells you how thick to forge the material down to. So what I should have done, instead of forging these pieces down to 7/8, or not 7/8, 3/4, then I should have forged them down to 1/2 inch, so that when I cut them out, they would have stacked back up, especially after cleaning, stacked back up, welded back up, and gone right into the forge, no problem with the handle attached. It would be a little bit easier to manage. It's also nice to have a little bit more length to work with in your restacks. These pieces were only like 2 3/16 long, but if I had reduced them in height by another 1/4 of an inch, that would have added probably another, at least another inch, maybe 1.5 inches to the length of each piece. I would have gotten 8 pieces out of it, but because I forged them down to 1/2 inch rather than 3/4 inch, that extra material, that 1/4 of an inch material from 3/4 down to 1/2 inch, gets essentially added onto each individual piece. Anyways, they're going to end up being longer. I'm not explaining that very well. Steel is looking nice. It's probably sitting at like 1900 right now. Did you TIG wrap the layers or just tack them? I only tack them on the end because I know this billet is going to go through a lot of reduction. I also didn't clean the billet up to a really high finish. It's like 36 grit between pieces. And there's still just a scant amount of forge scale in between, the tiniest amount. It's like 99.9% of the forge scale was cleaned off, but there's still just this tiniest little bit. But that's because I know that in this process of coming up to temp, soaking at high temp, and then setting the weld, it's going to give it time for it to clean itself out. And that's how I do it all the time these days. Now, if I'm getting closer to my final weld, like actually this next step is going to be the final, or the next phase of forge welding is going to be the last forge weld. That is when I take my material up to at least a 220 grit finish, so that everything just comes back together really nicely. The cleaner the material is, the more readily it will come back together, forge weld back together. Because not only it's because even at a microscopic level and an atomic level, the difference between 36 grit scratches, the peaks and valleys of a 36 grit scratch versus even a 220 are dramatically different. So there's a lot more, and especially if the pieces are nice and flat, it's going to be a lot of really good engagement. Here, let's take a look at this steel again. Of course, light adjust, but yeah, that steel's sitting at probably about 2,000 right now. Pretty dang hot. So, I think what happened, why I didn't forge it down farther from that 3/4 to the 1/2 inch, is that would have added probably, I don't know how much more time, but it would have added a lot more time. And I wasn't interested in forging anymore after a couple of setbacks that I was able to recover from. And hopefully people, even though things didn't go smoothly, there's a lot more to learn from things not going smoothly than them going smoothly. So I hope that there were definitely positive takeaways for people in regards to how to recover when your handle's falling off, or when a weld comes apart on one end or the other of the billet. I'm going to rotate this. look at it after I set the weld on this. I'm feeling good about this temp, so I'm actually going to start kind of a clock. Let me grab my timer. Because I didn't wrap it TIG all the way around, like Rich was asking, the edges are exposed. And so as that steel, once that steel goes in, there's oxygen between those layers. And so when you put the steel into the forge, that oxygen is there. And oxygen on your steel at high temperatures encourages oxidation of that steel, creating iron oxide and forge scale on that billet. So what I'm doing now that the steel is up to temperature with the forge, what I'm doing is I'm giving it time to clean it, to self-clean essentially. This is how dry welding works. And so trying to think of how to explain or how I've explained it in the past. So in between the layers, so forge scale with available oxygen, forge scale can develop. But what happens is also as the steel comes up to temperature, especially once it gets above critical, the carbon in the steel starts to move a lot more readily. Especially for carbon steel, that critical temperature is around 1350, 1375. It can vary based on alloying of the steel. It can be even actually a little bit higher. I think it's like 1385 or something. But anyways, or not the alloying, but the particular chemistry of the steel. So, but what happens when that steel is hot, and this is the reason a lot of people are like really sketched out when they're forging Damascus or forging even blades, and they're working in really hot forges, is that they're afraid they're just burning out the carbon out of the steel, because carbon depletion is a thing. The carbon in the steel will off-gas essentially. It'll move around throughout the material, and it'll eventually make its way to the surface, and then it will dissipate. Which is not favorable, but it is part of it is something that you have to be willing to accept if you're going to be making Damascus. The only way I think that somebody could potentially completely prevent that from happening is by canning their material, and that steel, or basically keeping oxygen from getting to the surface of the billet at any point. So you have to completely can the steel in some way. So, anyways, I don't can the steel. It's an extra step I don't take because I'm lazy, I don't know. But I also don't find it to be necessary. In my experience in making knives for the last 15 years, canning the steel to keep the oxygen or preserve the carbon in the material is not necessary. All of this is to talk about the fact that carbon is leaching out of your material, but it's not like pouring water through a sieve. It's not just falling right out of it. It moves out of the steel, but it's not moving super quickly. That is something important to keep in mind. So the way that the dry welding, like, so I do completely dry. I don't put any oil, I don't put kerosene, I don't put anything in there. I have started though thinking about the idea of doing some sort of kerosene or something like that. It doesn't hurt it to do it. But anyways, I'll explain why after I explain how the self-cleaning I guess, aspect of the steel works. So, initially, when you put that billet in there, in between those layers, actually, I just realized I'm probably wrong. In between those layers, you have oxygen, right? I'm going to try this. Cannot guarantee it's going to be good, but I'm going to try. Okay. You have it's going to be a caricature of everything that's in there. But you have O2. You got all these oxygen. You got all that oxygen in there, right? In between your layers. And then as the steel starts heating up, sorry, let me back up. So, this is what it looks like before you put it in the forge, and when you initially put it in the forge. You have all this oxygen in between, you have this carbon. But what happens as the steel heats up, the carbon starts moving all over the place. Right? Carbon moving all over the place. Eventually, it gets to the point, let me start a new drawing. It gets to the point where it's starting to off gas. So now, you got your carbon in the steel, but you also now have carbon leaving the steel. I credit my friend Peter Sporsberg for helping me to understand this. Carbon moving around within the steel is also starting to off gas, from, not only from the edges, but also between these layers. So it gets to a point where it creates a positive pressure between those layers, and then all that's in there, carbon making its way out. watching me draw, not very interesting. What I'm drawing is very interesting. So, it gets to the point where the carbon has pushed out all the oxygen. In fact, not only the free oxygen that's just air, which happens actually, I think, pretty quickly, but also any iron oxide, the oxygen aspect of the iron oxide that has developed on the surface of the steel. Basically, light forge scale. It's not going to be that much, but there's always going to be a little bit. That carbon, that free carbon that's escaping the steel, is also leaching onto the iron or the oxide connected to the iron oxide that is between those layers, and is also cleaning away that oxygen, leaving behind pure iron. So, with time, you are allowing your steel to self-clean. Again, it starts out with oxygen in between the layers, this carbon, the oxygen on the outside. But as you start to heat it up, the carbon starts moving around, and eventually the carbon starts leaving the steel. Now, initially, there's going to be some oxygen in here, but eventually, with time, there's going to be no oxygen, including the oxygen tied to iron oxide, and that steel will self-clean. So now, one of the reasons I'm probably going to start doing like a kerosene soap or something like that, even though like I don't have any problems. But it also takes like 2 seconds to do a soap of some sort of combustible between on the steel. Is that if you start out with soot essentially already on the surface of the steel, in between those different layers of steel, that is carbon. That is free carbon, and it's not going to hurt the layers. Now, I will say, depending on what you're using, that could potentially be an issue. I think that's why kerosene is kind of a pretty safe bet, that there's not any weird metals or minerals or whatever in that material versus what there could be in something like PV Blast or WD-40 or whatever else. Just like straight, pure petroleum. But it leaves behind a soot, and that soot is free carbon, and that will more readily reduce the oxygen between the layers of the steel. But it kind of ultimately comes down to the carbon getting hot enough so that not only is it moving around within that steel, but also off-gassing and leaching out of that steel to create that positive pressure between those layers, so that no more free oxygen within the forge chamber, because for the forge to burn, the fuel in the forge to burn, there has to be oxygen available there, right? It's actually drawing oxygen in, but that carbon depletion between those layers is creating enough positive pressure that no fresh oxygen is getting in. So oxygen that was present has been off-gassed or pushed out, and then oxygen that might have developed or might still be present through iron oxide with some time, soak time, it gives you the chance to, let's see, it stopped a long time ago apparently. I get talking, but anyways, it off-gasses and connects to the free or to the available oxygen in that iron oxide, drawing it out from between those layers. Okay, I see these questions. I gotta get this weld set, so I'm gonna move you guys over here. Should be an interesting one. Such a tall stack. the pressure down so that there's less fuel going in and heat things up. I want to actually cool the heat down. So, like I said, the forge is running about 2100 degrees, 2200 degrees. Actually, because I'm now, I should set this timer. We're gonna let it soak. The reason I want to pull the temperature down is because now I'm going to allow the steel to soak in the forge for like 20 minutes. Now, it doesn't need to be at welding temperatures. It just needs to be hot enough so that the carbon is, again, still moving pretty readily between within the material. I explained this yesterday, but I'll explain it again. Now that up to that, before I set that weld, you know, I welded these pieces together, I tacked them together, but at an atomic level, those pieces are worlds apart. And so by applying the heat and pressure, heat so it's plastic, and pressure to get it to compress and stick together, they will be now physically in contact at an atomic level, and they will now start to ideally start to begin trading bonds across those weld boundaries, where the pieces were separate. Now they're physically touching, and they're trading bonds between the layers, and to create a more homogeneous piece of material. And that is what is called a solid state diffusion welded bond. Gosh, there's something that popped into my head as I was talking about all this stuff. So anyway, so I want to give it time to do that. And all my work going forward is going to be trying to continue to encourage that weld bond while manipulating the material. But yeah, turning it down helps quite a lot. Okay, let's jump back through some of these comments. Marcelo says, keep up the good work, basically. Let's see, Alex, baby, your Instagram page is age restricted in my state now. Hell yeah, but them sweet carbides, put them sweet carbides in the solution. Yep. I mean, the carbides in this steel is nothing crazy. Rich says, after visiting Salem's shop, he used old quench oil. I've been doing that lately with good results. Nice. So he was referring back to when I was talking about doing a kerosene. So old quench oil works great. I don't quench that many blades, so I don't have a lot of old quench oil laying around. But I'm sure there are some oils that will work great that aren't necessarily quench oils, but ideally probably have no additives so that it's just oil. Alex Baby says again, so you're saying that carbon migration and or a light layer of carbon can actually assist when welding. So that light layer that you see in a finished piece, that is a result of carbon migration or carbon depletion. And so, and the reason you see, okay, and so in the welding process, especially as as you're building up layers, so you're stacking up pieces, like I'm welding these pieces together, that is beneficial. I do not want those carbon depleted layers in my finished piece though. And the reason you see those carbon depleted layers is one, they just exist on the outside of the steel initially, anyway. If I have, this is a super dirty bar of steel, but anyways, I have a bar of steel. Along the outside of this bar, there is a decarb layer or a region of depleted carbon content. And that is going to, in an etch, that is going to look silver or white almost. And so that's not necessarily the problem. The problem is and even just cleaning up the bare minimum to get through the forge scale just down to clean steel is also not a problem. The way you get those lines, those carbon depleted regions, those lines in your steel, is by rushing through the forge welding process. So basically, what happens is makers are scared that they're going to burn out all the carbon out of their steel, so they're trying to get through the forge welding process as quickly as possible. Now, in early rounds of forging, yeah, get through your welding processes as quickly as possible. Obviously, you want to control your material and control what the pattern's doing as best as you can, but otherwise, there's no reason to really go, or there's no need, especially in regard to carbon content, or I guess preventing carbon depletion, whatever. Anyways, work as fast or as slow as you want. But in that final, at least the final round, if not the final couple rounds of forge welding, taking your time is your friend. Allowing that steel to sit at high temperatures for long periods of time, especially through the forging. And often, honestly, what you're seeing are billets that are made, especially, it drives me nuts. It makes me sad, actually. It doesn't drive me crazy. It makes me sad. People will spend days and days and hours upon hours of work making these very intricate mosaic Damascus patterns. They'll cut the angle tiles, and then the angle tiles, and they'll do all the cleanup work, they'll get down to clean steel, but there's usually almost always still a bit of a decarb layer in there. So, what's happening is they get the steel welded up and as quickly as they possibly can, and they get it out of the forge. And then they stock remove the blade out of the steel, which is great. It helps the pattern, helps to preserve the aesthetic of the pattern, without kind of distorting it, if that's what you're going for. If you want forge distortion, then go for it. Forge that billet state. But most people are stock removing, so they're cutting the blade pattern out, which is fine, and is acceptable. But because it's not going through that forging process, it's not getting the extra time that it would normally get in the forge at high temperatures for that carbon to move around throughout what is now a homogeneous piece of material. And what part of the benefit of that carbon moving around and the steel being exposed to high temperature and that carbon moving around is that it helps to repopulate those depleted regions of the steel. So you have a carbon depleted area with that steel up to temperature and that carbon moving around, it helps to repopulate and homogenize the carbon content of that steel so you don't get those silver lines. But when you race through the tile weld and you stock remove the blade, you're going to end up with lines on your steel unless you do a ton of cleanup work to cut through. But most people are trying to do as minimal as possible, so they're basically losing as little material as possible because it takes a lot of time to make this stuff. But most people are only removing enough to get rid of the forge scale and take the steel up to a high polish finish, and then tile welding the material back together. But again, if you're only keeping the steel in the forge long enough just to get the steel to stick, you're not giving the steel enough time for the carbon to, at above critical, to migrate throughout the material and homogenize the carbon content and repopulate those carbon depleted regions. So you're going to get those silver lines. And so that, it makes me sad because to me, those silver lines don't look good. In fact, often they give away kind of like, it's like a magician just like doing close-up magic, but like showing you every part of the process, it's not very interesting. But if they're not showing you, or if they're hiding the weld lines, then you're creating something that seems a lot more interesting and kind of magical in a way. And so I hate those. I hate seeing those weld boundary or those decarb regions of those weld boundary lines, because it's really sad, because it seems like it's kind of giving away the secret. Not necessarily that it's a secret, but you're ruining the illusion, essentially. Let's see where we're at on the time. 10 more minutes. Okay. So what I'm doing right now, I talked about this yesterday, but this is what I call aging the weld. So essentially, instead of trying to get the steel out of there as quickly as possible, I'm giving it time to strengthen that weld bond at an atomic level. Because again, up to that point, the steel wasn't really physically in contact at an atomic level. Once it's hot, so that it can be plastically deformed, I don't think that's the right word, but anyways, go through plastic deformation, then you press it under a hammer or hydraulic press. Now they're physically in contact at an atomic level. And then at that point, that's when they start to develop those diffusion weld bonds. So by aging the weld, by turning down the temperature, still above critical, but not super hot at like welding temperatures, you're allowing that steel to encourage those atoms to travel and pass back and forth between each other, or between the individual pieces, creating that diffusion welded bond. So I like to just take my time. Sometimes if I got other stuff to do, I'll actually turn the forge temperature down even lower, still above critical, but lower, and I'll let it soak for like 30 minutes. Because I'm like rushed to get a blade ground, or I have other things in the shop I need to do. That's fine. I'll just turn the temperature down and let it soak for longer. But I still want to age that weld. Okay, it looks like we got some comments in here. Questions. Yes. Okay, Alex, building a positive pressure, that keeps oxygen off your welding surfaces. Oh. So the light layer has nothing to do with the carbon. Light layer is just carbon depleted areas, but the carbon depleting, or the carbon leaching out of the material, does help to create positive pressure zone between your layers of material, because it essentially is leaving the steel, displacing the oxygen, and not allowing new oxygen to get in. Noid says, I found a pair of snakeskin boots at a bus stop yesterday, and now I think I have pink eye. Okay. So by increasing soak times, carbon migration can help to recarburize. Yeah. Well, it's not recarburizing, because recarburize is carbon uptake, or carburizing is the material being in such a carbon-only atmosphere, and carbon in the gas form, that it actually uptakes into the material. That's carburizing. We're not carburizing the steel. We're allowing it time the carbon to freely move throughout the homogeneous material, especially once it's welded, to allow it to move throughout the material and repopulate those depleted regions. Carbon depleted areas, carbon migration can help to recarburize carbon depleted areas of material. Where's my understanding? No, I think you're understanding it. It's just the wrong term. It's not recarburizing. It's just homogenizing the carbon content. The carbon vibrates and moves around throughout the material, and eventually it makes its way to the surface of the steel and leaves, but it also helps to repopulate those carbon depleted areas. I'm going to give this steel a turn real quick. Gelm has jumped in. He says, what do you think about soaking the billet in Parks 50 before putting it in the forge? You can do that. I would, part of the problem with doing a soak is that you want your steel to cool down before you put it into anything to soak, whether it's kerosene, whether it's whatever. I've heard of people putting hot billets into kerosene. Any kind of combustible sketches me out. So I would at least try to let that steel cool down to the touch before putting it in the oil. Now I know that some of this steel, I mean, obviously the Parks 50 is, you know, you're quenching blades in it from 1500, 1475, whatever, 19, probably not 19, but anyways, high temperatures, much higher than what the steel is at. Steel is probably, and actually I'd be curious what the steel is at. I have an infrared thermometer here, but I would guess the steel is probably around 400 or 500 degrees. When you're done welding. So, I mean, potentially you can just put it in there, but I would make sure that if you're gonna put it in an oil of some sort, that it is one that can handle, or that has a high smoke point, I guess, or high burn point, because, yeah, last thing you want is a large mass of material causing a fire in your shop. Everything I've done has been to try to reduce the potential of a fire occurring in the shop. And honestly, like when I first started kind of dry welding, when I first started, making mosaic maskings and working for Bob Kramer, that's when we started experimenting with the dry welding, and it worked great. And then we were like, well, let's try it with nothing. And then we tried that, and that also works. So since then, I've just done it with nothing. One point I did want to make about setting the weld on billets like this is that on any billet, you want to make sure that the compression, that the force that you're applying, whether it's from a press, whether it's from a power hammer, whether it's from a hand hammer, what you do want to make sure is that compression, that force, is going through the entire height of the material, whatever the source of that pressure. So what I'm always looking for is the forge scale on the side. Because as you're heating up the steel, forge scale is developing on the outside. And then once you put it under a press or power hammer, that distorts the shape of the steel, causing that forge scale to break off. If you're not getting full compression all the way from the top to the bottom, you will only see a little bit of forge scale popping off at the top and a little bit of forge scale popping off at the bottom, but you won't see forge scale coming off in the middle. That means you're not applying enough force, you're not applying enough pressure, and you need to go farther. So pressing your material down until you can see that there's force that's been shoved all the way through the height of the material, all the way to the middle. That will encourage and ensure that you are getting a solid weld or solid compression through the entire height of the material. So I'm always, like I said, I'm always looking for that scale starting to pop up, and it's certainly most important on the first weld. So I'm getting ready to grab this steel out of here and do the second weld. I'm going to work kind of gently, especially because of how tall the billet is in relationship to its width. The material is 1.5 inches wide, but it ended up being like 6 inches tall. So that is outside the 3-to-1 ratio. That's close. That's like a 4-to-1 ratio, basically. Now that can work, but you got to be careful. So that's weird to say 4-to-1 in relationship to a 6 inch by 1.5 1.5 inch piece of material. Anyways, okay, I'm gonna pull this out and I'm gonna get squishing on it again. And then after this, all we're doing, keeping it hot and working it. We're gonna draw this billet out. And at a certain point, I'm going to knock it out of square. But I won't do that probably before truing up kind of the outside edges of the billet, and then I'll knock it out of square. I'm gonna work that billet down. Like I said, it's 1.5 inch, or started at 1.5 inch by 6. I'm gonna probably work it down to about probably down to 1.25 inches, if not 1 inch by, and again, I'm trying to maintain that 3-to-1 ratio. So 1.5 inches, or sorry, 1.25 inches by 3, or sorry, 1 inch by 3, or 1.5 inches, or 1.25 inches by 3 3/4, so just under 4. Before knocking it out of square. Actually, I'll probably do it sooner than later. Yeah, knock it out of square, lock in that width. Yeah, and these dies, my forging dies are 4 inches wide, so I gotta do it at like that 4-inch height. So I have to at least reduce this billet down to from 6 inches to 4 inches. So that's a 33% reduction right there. That feels like a pretty good reduction. We are definitely, by the time this billet's done though, reduction height that is. We're gonna get through probably at least a 50% reduction in height. All right, let's get this billet out here. Let's do some forging. Yeah, gloves just let's see if I can find it. Okay. Something's happening that's not the greatest. some of you are probably already starting to see. Plect Tremura. What's up? Thank you for jumping in and joining the stream. So something that's happening, which you probably potentially could already see, is that the billet is starting to buckle or curve a little bit. Again, once you get outside of that 3-to-1 ratio of the width of the base in either direction and the height, then weird things can start to happen. And actually, the way I found this out was when I was forging solid stock, forging monosteel. So I had 1-inch solid stock. This is hex stock, which you can get from Maritime Knife Supply. But I'm just gonna use it as an example. I had a piece and I was like, I'm gonna use 4 inches of this 1-inch stock to forge out a knife. But before I do that, I want to drive it down to upset it and make it bigger, like a larger stock that I can work with. What I did not anticipate was that because of that, so that means the footprint of that piece was 1 inch by 1 inch, right? But the height was 4 inches. So what was happening? It was causing that, like instantaneously, that stack went whop like that, and I just was like, oh, that's not a big deal. I didn't think it was a big deal. I'll just fix that later. It is a big deal. It's not good. And so what I'll do to fix this, to straighten it back out, is I'm not going to put the